I left after 20 years of marriage. What I felt the next morning shocked me. I didn't cry. I didn't feel proud. I didn't even feel free. I felt still, quiet, like I was standing in the middle of a room that used to be on fire, and now there was nothing but smoke. People always ask women like me, what finally made you leave? As if there's some clear, cinematic moment. There wasn't. No nulling, no bruises, no cops, no broken glass. Just silence. One day, I woke up and I realized I hadn't heard my own voice in years. Not my laugh, not my opinions, not even my breath. I was alive, technically, but I wasn't there. That first morning, I sat in a motel room, legs pulled up to my chest, drinking cheap coffee that tasted like paper, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 decades. I wasn't scared. Not of him coming home, not of saying the wrong thing, not of looking too happy or too tired or too emotional. I wasn't scared of being me. And that, more than anything, is what broke me. I didn't even realize how deeply afraid I'd been until that fear was gone. That's the part no one tells you about. When the abuse doesn't leave bruises, you spend years convincing yourself that you're fine, that you're safe, that this is just what marriage looks like. And when the noise finally stops, it's not peace you feel first. It's grief. Grief for all the years you spent quiet. Grief for all the times you pretended everything was okay. Grief for the version of you that kept shrinking just to survive. I'm not telling this story because I want sympathy. I'm telling it because maybe, just maybe, someone out there feels the same stillness I did, and they're wondering what it means. This is what it means. You're not crazy, you're not ungrateful, and you're not alone. I used to tell myself I was lucky. He didn't hit me, he paid the bills, he didn't cheat, at least not that I know of. And when you say that out loud, people tilt their heads and go, well, then what was so bad? That's the trap. That's how it works. You start listing the things he didn't do instead of the things you lost. I lost myself. Not in one moment, not in a dramatic collapse, but in tiny, invisible ways. Every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace, every time I changed my mind so he wouldn't roll his eyes, every time I laughed at a joke that hurt me, every time I apologized just to end the argument. That's how it happens, slowly, quietly, and you don't even notice it until one day you look in the mirror and you don't recognize the woman staring back. Not because she's older, but because she's gone. She's polite, she's agreeable, she smiles at dinner parties and says she's just tired, but she doesn't dream anymore. She doesn't ask for anything. She doesn't expect to be heard. I became that woman, and I was so good at it, I fooled even myself. I thought it was maturity. I thought it was love. I thought this was just what growing up looked like. Sacrificing and compromising and learning to not take things so personally. But it wasn't growth. It was survival. And I was doing it so quietly, no one even noticed I was drowning. Not even me. There were moments, small, quiet ones, when I'd catch a glimpse of who I used to be. Like when a song from college played in the grocery store and I caught myself mouthing the lyrics before I looked around to make sure no one saw. Or when I laughed too hard at something my friend said and he gave me that look, the one that says, tone it down. Those moments didn't feel like rebellion. They felt dangerous. Like I was breaking some silent rule I never agreed to. I didn't wake up one day and decide to be afraid of my own joy. It just happened. The longer I stayed, the more I adapted. I learned to read his moods before he even said a word. I learned how to make excuses for him when he ignored me in front of others. I learned to shrink my happiness because anything that wasn't about him felt like a threat to his control. And that's the thing. It wasn't about love. It was about control. He didn't want a partner. He wanted an audience, someone to reflect back the version of himself he needed to believe in. And I played the part. God, I played it so well. I was the supportive wife, the calm one, the understanding one, the one who said, "It's okay, I get it," even when I didn't, especially when I didn't. Because the moment I pushed back, even a little, he would go quiet. That long, punishing silence. It was never yelling, it was withdrawal. Disappointment. Like I had broken something delicate and now had to earn my way back to being safe. So I stopped pushing. I stopped asking. And eventually, I stopped speaking at all.
The silence was the worst part. Not the kind you get after a fight, when both people need space. His silence was different. It was deliberate, cold, a way to remind me who held the power. He could go days without speaking to me. I'd try to make conversation about dinner, about work, about something I saw online, and he'd respond with a grunt or not at all. And every time I asked, "Is something wrong?" he'd say, "You're imagining things." Or worse, "You're too sensitive." Those words cut deeper than any insult because they made me question my own reality. I started walking on eggshells, not just around him, but inside myself, editing every thought before I spoke it, rehearsing neutral tones, smiling when I didn't feel like it. I didn't want to give him a reason to go quiet again, because that quiet wasn't peaceful. It was punishment, a reminder that my voice didn't matter, that I could speak, sure, but he didn't have to hear me. I think a part of me started to believe I deserved it, that if I were just more patient, more grateful, more accommodating, the silence would go away. But it never did. It only got heavier, like a fog that crept into every corner of my life. I'd go to work and be cheerful, helpful, kind, and then come home and fold into myself like paper. No one knew, not really. Because what do you say? My husband ignores me when I exist too loudly. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds petty. But it was real. And it was constant. And over time, that silence became louder than any scream. I used to lie awake at night and wonder if I was overreacting. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe this was just what marriage looked like after a while. Routine, quiet, distant. Everyone says relationships take work. So I worked. I adjusted. I compromised. I swallowed things I should have screamed. And every time something felt off, I'd find a way to explain it. He's just tired. He doesn't mean it like that. He had a rough childhood. I gave him every benefit of the doubt, even when he stopped giving me the smallest kindness. There was no affection, no warmth, no curiosity about my day, my thoughts, my life. I became furniture, present, functional, but unnoticed. The kind of presence you only miss when it's gone. But still, I stayed, because leaving felt impossible. I wasn't afraid of starting over. I was afraid I wouldn't know how. I had spent so many years molding myself to his preferences that I no longer knew which parts were me and which parts were just survival. And then there was shame. Quiet, thick shame. Because what kind of woman stays in a marriage where love feels like an obligation, where comfort is replaced by anxiety, where intimacy feels like a performance? I didn't want to admit I'd made a mistake, that I'd invested years into something that only gave me silence in return. So I wore the mask,
I told the stories. I smiled in photos. And deep down, I wondered if I was the broken one. Because if nothing's wrong, then maybe I'm just not strong enough to be happy.
Looking back, the warning signs were always there, but they came dressed as charm, as protection, as love. In the beginning, he'd say things like, "I just worry about you," when I went out with friends. Or, "You're too good for them," when I laughed too loud at a joke someone else made. At first, it felt flattering, like he saw me, like he cared. But slowly, it shifted. The questions turned into guilt, the concern turned into control. "Why do you need to go out? What do you even talk to her about? You never laugh like that when you're with me." It wasn't yelling, it wasn't threats, it was quieter than that. Just enough to make me second guess myself. So I started pulling back, canceling plans, choosing him again and again, even when he wasn't really choosing me. And he noticed. He liked it. He liked the way I stopped wearing certain clothes, the way I stopped talking so much at dinner, the way I started asking, "Is this okay?" before making even the smallest decisions. At the time, I called it love. I thought I was just compromising, being considerate. I thought, this is what it means to be in a serious relationship. But it wasn't compromise. It was erasure. Little by little, I was giving up pieces of myself to avoid disappointing him. And the worst part, I thought that meant I was doing something right. That maybe if I became small enough, quiet enough, easy enough, he'd finally feel safe enough to love me fully. But all I really did was disappear. When you live like that long enough, you start to forget what normal feels like. You stop trusting your gut, your memory, your own eyes. I remember once, years into the marriage, I laughed too hard at a movie while we were watching TV. Nothing dramatic, just a normal laugh. And he turned and looked at me like I'd done something wrong. Not angry, just irritated, like joy was something I should ration. I spent the rest of the night quiet, afraid I'd embarrassed him, afraid I'd been too much. That's what I learned to do. Shrink myself. Be smaller. Softer. Less. I became an expert at reading his face, his posture, his tone. I could sense a bad mood before he even opened his mouth, and I would adjust my words, my energy, even my body language, so he wouldn't spiral. And when he did, I blamed myself. I'd replay conversations in my head over and over, trying to figure out what I said wrong, how I could have been better, kinder, quieter. That's how you lose yourself. Not in one big moment, but in 1,000 small ones where you choose peace over truth, where you choose their comfort over your reality. I started to forget who I was outside of keeping him happy. I didn't dance in the kitchen anymore. I stopped singing in the car. I didn't call my friends back. I told myself I was just tired. But really, I was disappearing, one compromise at a time, one silence after another, until I wasn't sure where he ended and I began. I don't remember the exact day it happened, but I remember the feeling. It was small, barely there. I was sitting alone in the car outside the grocery store, staring at the steering wheel, hands frozen on the keys. And I thought, what if I just didn't go home right now? Not forever, not dramatically, just what if I drove somewhere else? Sat at the beach, got a coffee, listened to music he wouldn't like. That thought felt like a betrayal, like cheating, like I was breaking some invisible contract I never agreed to sign. I didn't leave, of course. I went home, made dinner,
asked how his day was. But something shifted that day. A crack in the wall, a tiny voice that said, "There's more than this." I tried to ignore it. I buried it under routines, laundry, to-do lists. I told myself I was lucky, that I should be grateful, that he wasn't violent, that some people have it worse. But that voice kept coming back. Quiet, steady, honest. Not angry, just sad. It would whisper when I brushed my teeth at night, when I stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m., when I caught my reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back. "You're not okay," it said. And you know it. I think that's how change starts. Not with fireworks or ultimatums, but with a whisper you stop trying to silence. A truth you finally stop apologizing for. That tiny part of you that still believes in something softer, something safer, something like freedom. And even if you don't move right away, the moment you hear that voice and actually listen to it, your life has already begun to change. It started with something small. I bought a candle. That's it. A stupid, overpriced candle from a store he always said was a waste of money. I walked past it 100 times before, but that day I picked it up, paid for it in cash, brought it home, and lit it when he wasn't there. It smelled like vanilla and smoke, and something warm I couldn't name. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the flame like it was a secret I wasn't supposed to have. It sounds ridiculous, I know, a candle. But when you've spent years asking permission for everything, your tone, your outfits, your meals, doing something just for yourself feels dangerous. That candle wasn't about fragrance, it was about space. About proof that I still existed somewhere under the dust. That I could still want something just because I liked it. He didn't notice at first, or if he did, he didn't say anything. But I felt it. That tiny flicker of defiance. That tiny reclaiming. And after that, it got harder to go back to pretending, to shrinking. I started listening to music in the car again. I started walking slower on my lunch breaks. I started looking strangers in the eye. Not much, just enough to feel like a person instead of a shadow. I didn't call it a plan. I didn't even call it hope, but it was movement. And after years of standing still, movement, any movement, felt like rebellion, like breath, like the beginning of a life I hadn't dared to imagine in years. He noticed eventually. Not the candle, not the music, those were too subtle, but the shift in me. The way I didn't flinch when he sighed, the way I didn't rush to fill the silence, the way I looked a little less afraid. He didn't get angry. He got curious, soft even, asked if everything was okay, told me I'd seemed distant lately. It wasn't concern, it was inventory. He was checking his grip, seeing how far I'd slipped. And when I didn't immediately apologize, when I didn't rush to reassure him, he shifted, not into rage, into confusion, into guilt. "You know I've always loved you, right?" he said one night. "I know I'm not perfect, but I've always done my best." That's what made it so hard. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't cruel all the time. He was just never safe. I never knew which version of him I'd get. The quiet one, the charming one, the one who made me feel like a burden for asking him to listen. So I nodded, said I was just tired, said I'd been in my head. And the truth is, I had. But not in the way he thought. I wasn't spinning in anxiety anymore. I was watching. Not him, me. Watching how I softened my voice again, how I folded my hands, how I said, "I'm fine," even when I wasn't. The difference now was that I noticed. And once you start noticing, it's hard to unsee. The performance, the patterns, the ways you've learned to disappear without anyone having to ask you to. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing you can do in a relationship like that. Wake up.
People think leaving is a decision you make all at once. A big, bold moment, a suitcase, a door slam, a final scream. But that's not how it was for me. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like an ending that had already happened long before I admitted it out loud. Like my body had known for years, and my mind was just catching up. There wasn't a fight, no final straw, no dramatic betrayal. Just a quiet morning where I looked around and thought, I can't do this anymore. Not because I hated him, but because I no longer hated myself enough to stay. That's what most people don't understand. Sometimes it's not about anger, it's about exhaustion. A deep, soul-level tiredness from constantly managing someone else's emotions at the cost of your own. I didn't need one more reason to leave. I'd had thousands. I just needed the silence inside me to get loud enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. And it did. It came in waves, gentle but final, like the ocean pulling back. And one day, I started quietly collecting the pieces. Not things. Clarity, strength, permission. I didn't even tell anyone at first, because I wasn't looking for advice. I wasn't looking for courage. I was just done. That kind of done that doesn't need to be explained, doesn't need to be justified, just lived. And maybe that's what freedom actually is. Not fireworks, not escape, just the moment when you stop negotiating with your own suffering. The day I left, the sky was gray. Not stormy, not dramatic, just quiet. Still. I packed a single bag. Not everything, just what I needed to feel human. A few clothes, a toothbrush, my journal. I didn't leave a note. I didn't cry. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I just walked out. Not because I had a place to go, but because I couldn't stay. He was in the kitchen when I left, reading something on his phone. He looked up briefly, said, "You going somewhere?" I said, "Just out." My voice didn't shake. I didn't look back. I think part of him knew, maybe not that I wouldn't return, but that something had shifted beyond repair. And maybe that scared him, or maybe he was just confused. But he didn't follow me. He didn't call. He didn't chase. He just went back to his screen. And I walked to my car like I was underwater. Everything in slow motion. My hands were steady. My heart was loud. But it wasn't fear I felt. It was relief. Pure, aching relief. Like taking off shoes that never quite fit. Like exhaling after holding your breath for years. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan. But for the first time in 2 decades, I wasn't waiting for permission to move. I wasn't waiting to be loved, to be heard, to be safe. I was choosing myself. Not loudly, not perfectly, but finally. The next morning, I woke up in a motel bed that smelled like old soap and cheap bleach. The room was small, beige, anonymous, but it was mine. No tension in the walls, no footsteps outside the door that made my stomach tighten, just stillness. I lay there for a long time before moving. My body didn't quite believe it was real, that he wasn't in the next room, that I didn't have to brace myself before I spoke. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just breathed. Slowly, deeply, like my lungs had been waiting years for permission. I made instant coffee from a tiny machine by the sink. sat on the edge of the bed, holding the cup with both hands like it might float away. The silence was strange, not empty, honest. I could hear my own thoughts again, and they weren't begging for approval or afraid of being wrong. They were just mine. That was the moment that surprised me the most. Not the leaving, but the morning after. The absence of fear. The absence of shame. Just this quiet, steady sense that I was finally allowed to exist without explanation. I wasn't happy yet. I wasn't healed, but I was free. And freedom, I was learning, doesn't always come with joy. Sometimes it comes with nothing but a heartbeat, a window cracked open, a morning where no one interrupts your peace. And for now, that was enough.
I think the first time I knew something was really wrong was years before I ever admitted it. I was sitting on a park bench, watching a woman walk by with her daughter. They were laughing about something small and silly, and I remember thinking, she looks so light. Not thin, not fashionable. Light. Like her body wasn't carrying the weight of apology. Like she didn't have to calculate her every word. I sat there holding my phone, pretending to text, and suddenly this voice inside me said, "You could have that too." Just like that. Clear, uninvited, and terrifying. Because I didn't believe it. Not really. I'd spent so long convincing myself that what I had was enough, that wanting more was selfish, that healthy relationships were for other people, braver people, people who didn't flinch when they heard the front door open. So I brushed the thought away, went home, cooked dinner, told myself I was fine. But the voice didn't go away. It whispered when he mocked me in front of his friends, when he joked about how dramatic I was, when he said, "You're lucky I put up with you." At the time, I laughed too, smiled, tried to play along. But inside, I was keeping score. And that one sentence, "You could have that too," stayed with me. It didn't grow louder, it just waited, patiently, until I was ready to hear it without shame, until I was ready to believe it wasn't selfish to want peace, that maybe I didn't have to earn softness by surviving suffering, that maybe, just maybe, I could choose it. Freedom didn't come with a grand new life. It came with ordinary things that suddenly felt extraordinary. Buying groceries without rushing, leaving my phone on silent, eating dinner alone without swallowing anxiety. I wasn't starting over like people say in books. I was starting from scratch, from silence, from stillness. I remember walking through a bookstore one afternoon, touching the spines of novels I'd never let myself buy before. Not because he forbade it, but because he'd laugh. "Another book? What are you even looking for?" And I'd laugh too, like I wasn't sure. But I was sure. I was always sure. I just stopped trusting myself to want things. So I bought a book that day, sat on the park with a coffee, and read 3 pages before crying. Not because the words were sad, but because they were mine. That moment was mine. No one was interrupting. No one was watching. I was safe in the smallest, purest sense. And for someone who had lived with constant emotional tension, that safety felt unreal, almost suspicious, like I didn't deserve it yet, like joy was still something I had to earn. But I kept showing up to it anyway, kept sitting in that park, kept letting the quiet in. Not all at once, not without guilt, but little by little, I was learning that peace isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with applause. It shows up in moments when no one's watching and nothing hurts. And for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't waiting for the next apology. I was building a life where I didn't need one. People started to ask questions. Not right away, but eventually. A few friends reached out, some from genuine concern, others from curiosity dressed up as care. What happened? Did he cheat? Did something happen? I never knew how to answer. Because what do you say when the damage wasn't loud? When there's no headline, no visible scar, just years of erasure and fear and quiet survival? I'd say things like, it just wasn't working anymore, or I needed space. And most people nodded, but I could see it in their eyes. Disbelief, confusion, maybe even judgment. He was so charming, so successful, so nice. I wanted to explain it all. Every silence, every manipulation, every moment I doubted my own sanity. But I didn't. Because explaining myself started to feel like a return to the prison I just escaped. I didn't leave so I could build a better story. I left so I could live one. And still, there were moments when guilt crept in, when I wondered if I should have tried harder, if I owed someone a clearer answer. But deep down, I knew this wasn't their story to hold. It was mine. And I didn't need to make it palatable to make it real. That's something I remind myself often. Just because people don't understand your pain doesn't mean it wasn't pain. Just because they didn't hear the cracks doesn't mean you didn't break. I didn't leave to be understood. I left to be whole. I thought that guilt would be about leaving, about hurting him, about breaking the vows, but it wasn't. The real guilt came later, when the dust settled, and I had to face myself. Not as a victim, but as a woman who allowed herself to disappear. That was the hardest part. Not the memories of what he said or didn't say, but the silence I gave him. The permission. The years I spent pretending it wasn't that bad. I kept thinking, how did I let this happen? How did I, someone who used to be loud and wild and full of fight, become so small, so easy to please, so easy to quiet? It wasn't about blaming myself for his actions. I know he made choices. I know he wielded control like it was kindness, but still, I let it in. I let it stay. And that's the part no one warns you about. That leaving is only the beginning. That healing requires honesty. And sometimes that honesty hurts worse than the past because it asks you to admit the ways you abandoned yourself long before anyone else did. I've sat with that guilt, let it roll through me, let it break me open. But I've also learned something softer. I did the best I could with what I knew. I was surviving, I was adapting, I was loving him the only way I knew how, by losing myself. And now, piece by piece, I'm learning a different kind of love. One that starts here, with me, with the girl I used to be, with the woman I'm becoming. And that love doesn't come from perfection. It comes from forgiveness. One day, a few months after I left, I caught my reflection in a shop window. I almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked different, but because I didn't look afraid. I wasn't watching my posture. I wasn't scanning the sidewalk behind me. I was just walking. Like I had a right to take up space. Like I belonged in my own life. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not arrogance, not revenge. Just this quiet, grounded pride that whispered, "You made it out." I didn't cry. I didn't stop. I just kept walking with that feeling tucked in my chest like a secret. It wasn't about escaping him. It was about returning to me, the version of myself I'd buried under so many years of people-pleasing and fear. I started doing more things like that, things that made me feel real. I signed up for a class at the library. I started journaling again. I smiled at strangers, not because I had to, but because I could. And every time I did something without asking for permission, it felt like stitching a piece of myself back together. The world didn't suddenly become perfect. I still had hard days. I still had doubts. but I was no longer living under someone else's shadow. I was standing in the light, even if it was dim, even if it flickered. And for the first time, I wasn't surviving. I was living, slowly, bravely, honestly. And that, I realize, is something to be proud of. I wasn't looking to meet anyone. I wasn't even open to the idea. Romance felt like a foreign country I no longer believed in. But one afternoon, in a bookstore cafe, a man asked if he could sit across from me. All the other seats were taken. I said yes without thinking, then immediately felt that old tension creep in, that need to be polite, to manage expectations, to make myself small. But he just sat quietly, sipping his coffee, reading a magazine. No questions, no comments, just space. After a while, he glanced up and said something about the weather. I nodded, he smiled. That was it. No follow-up, no pressure. Just a human being making simple, harmless conversation. And for some reason, that small moment unraveled me a little, because it reminded me of how many years I spent decoding every word, every pause, every look, trying to stay safe. And here was a stranger who didn't need anything from me, who didn't take my presence as an invitation to consume me. I left before he did, just said, "Have a good day," and walked out. But as I stepped back into the street, I realized something. I hadn't performed, not once. I hadn't adjusted my voice, or smiled too much, or tried to be likable. I just existed. And that felt like a miracle. Not because of him, but because of me. Because I was finally starting to believe that I could be seen without being used, that I could be heard without being corrected, that I could be in the world soft, whole, and free, and that would be enough. It came as a text, just a few words. "Hope you're okay." Months of silence, and then that. No apology, no real question, just a hook. A line cast into the dark, hoping I might still be floating close enough to bite. I stared at the message for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't feel the need to say anything at all. The old me would have spiraled, would have read it a dozen times, searching for hidden meaning, would have wondered if this was a sign, a second chance, a window cracked open. But now it felt like a door I'd already walked through and closed behind me, locked even. I didn't feel anger, I didn't feel fear. I felt distance, the kind of distance that isn't just physical, but cellular, like my body had rewritten its code to no longer respond to that frequency. I didn't reply, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I didn't owe him anything anymore. Not clarity, not closure. I gave him years of explanation. I gave him silence. I gave him the best of me while I starved for crumbs. And now my peace was mine. And I wasn't about to trade it back for a flicker of guilt or nostalgia. That's when I knew, really knew, that healing wasn't just something I was chasing. It was something I had already begun to hold. Quietly, steadily, without permission, without apology. And when the phone buzzed again, hours later, I didn't even look. I just turned it face down, picked up my book, and kept reading. I started noticing other women, not in a comparing way, in a remembering way. I'd see them in the grocery store, in coffee shops, sitting in parked cars, with their hands still on the steering wheel long after the engine stopped. They looked tired. But not the kind of tired sleep could fix, the kind of tired that comes from being invisible, from editing every sentence before you speak it, from living your whole life trying not to make things worse. One woman stood in front of me in line at a pharmacy, her partner beside her, scrolling his phone. She turned to ask a question, something small about dinner, and he didn't even look up, just grunted. And I saw it. That flicker in her face, the quick swallow of her voice, the way her shoulders rounded just a little more. I wanted to say something, to reach out, but I didn't. Because I knew words wouldn't land. Not yet. I've been her. I've stood exactly where she stood, shrinking by the second, convincing myself it's not that bad, that he's just tired, that I shouldn't be so sensitive. But now that I'm on the other side, I see it everywhere. The quiet disappearing, the way women vanished without ever leaving, and I want to scream sometimes. Not at them, but for them. To let them know they're not crazy, that the absence of bruises doesn't mean the absence of pain, that they deserve more than endurance. But all I can do is live my truth, loud enough that maybe one day, if they're ready, they'll hear it and remember themselves. For years, I lived from the neck up. Everything was survival, strategy, calculation, language. I ignored my body unless it hurt. I dismissed feelings unless they exploded. Stillness made me anxious. Silence made me suspicious. I was always bracing for impact. But slowly, after I left, I began to come back to myself. Not in a dramatic way, in the smallest ways possible. I started noticing the warmth of sunlight through a window, the weight of a blanket at night, the sound of my own footsteps when no one else was around. I began to stretch in the mornings, not for exercise, just to feel where my edges were. I cooked for myself, not to impress, not to serve, but to nourish. I stood barefoot on the floor and actually noticed the ground. And it hit me one day. I wasn't waiting for tension anymore. My shoulders weren't tight. My stomach wasn't clenched. I wasn't bracing. I was just here, alive, present. It was subtle, but revolutionary, because when you've lived in a constant state of alert, peace feels unnatural, even dangerous, like something you don't deserve. Like quiet is a setup for pain. But the more I sat with that discomfort, the more I realized it wasn't the world that was unsafe. It was the version of me that had learned to survive at any cost. And now, with space and breath and time, I was unlearning. Gently, patiently. And in that unlearning, I was finding something I never knew I could have. Safety inside myself. I used to think loneliness was the worst feeling in the world, that silence meant failure, that an empty room was proof something had gone wrong. So I stayed, in rooms filled with tension, in relationships that hollowed me out just to avoid being alone. But now I see it differently. Solitude is not the absence of love. It's the presence of self. I don't fill every silence anymore. I don't keep the TV on for background noise. I let the stillness in. Let it stretch. I eat meals alone and actually taste the food. I go on walks without a destination. I sit on the floor and breathe, not because it's a ritual, but because it reminds me I'm here. Fully, honestly. For a long time, I confused company with safety. I thought having someone nearby, even someone who made me feel invisible, was better than being by myself. But now I know the difference between alone and abandoned. I know that peace doesn't always include another voice, that love can start in the quiet, that healing often requires room no one else can enter. I'm not lonely. I'm whole. And yes, some nights are still hard, some mornings still feel heavy, but they belong to me, my rhythm, my breath, my pace. And in that quiet, I've started hearing something I hadn't in years. Myself. Not the scared version, not the pleasing one, but the voice that says, "You're doing it. You're here. Keep going." For a long time, I hated the woman I used to be. I saw her as weak, blind, cowardly. I looked back on all the years I stay and wanted to scream at her, shake her, pull her out. Why didn't you leave sooner? Why did you let it get that far? How could you not see it? But now I see her differently. I see her as someone who was doing her best, someone who survived in the only way she knew how. She wasn't stupid. She was scared. She wasn't broken. She was protecting what little of herself she had left. She was walking through fog, trying to keep her heart beating, one small step at a time. And honestly, she was brave. Because survival in that kind of love takes more courage than anyone wants to admit. You tell yourself it's fine. You learn how to smile without feeling. You memorize what not to say. You manage pain in doses. You become so good at disappearing that one day you forget you were ever real. But still, she kept something alive inside me, a tiny flicker, a quiet whisper, the one that said, "There's more than this." She didn't leave right away. She wasn't ready, but she waited. She held on. And because of her, I made it here. So no, I don't hate her anymore. I thank her for enduring, for protecting me the only way she could. And now, every time I catch myself being hard on that version of me, I stop, I breathe, and I say, "You did good. You made it out. I've got it from here."
I used to think healing would feel like triumph, like some mountaintop moment where everything made sense and nothing hurt anymore. But it didn't come like that. It came slowly, quietly, in ordinary mornings and early nights, in soft clothes and deep exhales, in not needing to explain myself to anyone. It came when I stopped chasing the better version of me and started making space for the one who already existed. Tired, honest, human. I don't have all the answers. Some days I still feel heavy. Some nights I still wake up reaching for old versions of comfort. But more and more I feel steady, present, not performing, not fixing, just being. That used to feel impossible, to just exist without apology, to belong to myself. But now it feels like truth, like breath, like home. I cook slow meals. I play music no one critiques. I dance in the kitchen when I feel like it. I cry when I need to. And I don't hide it, not from myself, not anymore. There's power in that kind of presence, in saying, "This is who I am, and I'm allowed to be here." It's not a statement I scream, it's a life I live. Quietly, fully. Every day I choose myself is a day I rewrite the story that told me I was too much, too soft, too complicated. And each time I do, I feel something settle inside me. Not like a celebration, like a return. Like I've been walking for years and finally found my way back to the one place I never should have left. Me. If I could speak to the woman I used to be, the one still making excuses for him, still blaming herself, still praying that maybe tomorrow he'll be kind, I wouldn't tell her to leave. Not yet. She wouldn't hear it. I know that now. I wouldn't give her a checklist or scream, "You deserve better," through the noise. I would just sit beside her, quietly. I'd place a hand on her shoulder, not to shake her, but to hold her steady. And I'd say, "You're not crazy. You're not weak. You're tired." And that's not the same thing. I'd tell her that love should not require her silence, that her softness is not the problem, that being confused in this kind of pain is part of how it works. It keeps you foggy, keeps you hoping, keeps you questioning yourself so much that leaving feels like betrayal. But it's not. It's survival. I'd tell her that her story doesn't end in this house, in this version of love.
that there's a world beyond this ache, that she'll find her voice again. Not the one he trained her to use, the real one. And when she does, it will shake her, because she'll realize it was never gone, just buried, waiting. I wouldn't rush her. I wouldn't beg her. I'd just let her know there is life after this. A good one. A quiet one. A life where her name isn't spoken in anger, where her worth isn't measured by how much she can endure. A life she gets to live fully, freely, finally, for herself. Lately, I've started feeling something I don't fully have words for. It's not happiness, exactly, not excitement. It's quieter than that, deeper, like a low hum beneath everything, like steady ground after years of falling. I think it's called stability. Not the fake kind I used to chase, performing calm on the outside while drowning inside. No, this is different. This is knowing that whatever happens, I won't abandon myself again. It's the quiet confidence of trusting my own instincts, of hearing a red flag and not arguing with it, of saying no without guilt, of resting without proving I've earned it. For so long, my nervous system was always in defense mode, always scanning for danger. Even when things were calm, I didn't believe it. I'd flinch at kindness, brace for the turn. But now there's space. Not because life is perfect, but because I am no longer at war with myself. That's what no one tells you about real healing. It's not about reaching joy, it's about releasing fear. It's about waking up and not immediately calculating how to survive the day. It's about trusting that your presence doesn't have to be negotiated, that your softness doesn't make you a target, and that love, real love, doesn't require you to shrink. I'm not waiting for the next chapter anymore. I'm living it, one quiet moment at a time, with both feet on the ground, and a voice in my chest that finally feels like mine.
Sometimes I wonder why I'm telling this story, Al. Why share something so personal, so private? I used to think stories like mine didn't matter, that if there wasn't violence, if there weren't headlines, then it wasn't enough to talk about. But I've come to understand something. Silence is what kept me stuck. Silence is what told me I was alone, that no one would understand, that my pain wasn't valid because it wasn't loud enough. So now I speak. Not for sympathy, not for attention, but for someone out there who's still in it, still questioning, still convincing herself it's not that bad. If that's you, if you're listening, I want you to know this. You are not crazy. You're not dramatic. You're not broken. You are responding exactly as someone does when love becomes survival. And no, it's not too late. I don't care how long you've stayed. I don't care how many times you've justified it, explained it, made excuses for it. You are allowed to leave. You're allowed to change. You are allowed to build a life that makes sense to your soul, even if it's quiet, even if no one claps, even if they don't believe you. You don't need their permission. You need your own. I didn't tell this story to be saved. I told it to say I made it out. And if you're still waiting for a sign, this is it. Your life doesn't have to be this small. Your light doesn't have to stay dim. You are not alone. Not anymore.
I used to carry the past like armor. Every memory a reason to stay guarded. Every mistake a chain around my ankles. I thought I needed it to remember, to protect myself, to make sense of what happened. But the truth is, the past doesn't need to be carried to be honored. It doesn't need to hold my hand to shape who I am. So, little by little, I've started setting it down. Not erasing it, not pretending it didn't happen, just loosening my grip. I still remember the sound of his voice when he was angry, the weight of walking on eggshells, the way my own reflection looked like someone else's. But those memories no longer hold me hostage. They pass through me now, like shadows across a wall, present but powerless. I don't need to relive them to stay safe. I don't need to repeat them to stay strong. I am strong because I chose to stay soft, because I chose to leave without needing him to understand why, because I rebuilt myself without revenge, without spectacle, without apology. The past will always be part of me, but it's no longer the loudest voice in the room. Now, when it whispers, I listen, I nod, and then I keep walking toward a future that doesn't ask me to bleed for love, that doesn't measure my worth by how much I can endure, that welcomes me fully, quietly, just as I am. And that's all I ever wanted.
There's no neat ending to a story like this. No final chapter where everything is wrapped up and perfect. Life doesn't work like that. Healing doesn't work like that. But here's what I know now. I'm no longer waiting to be rescued. I'm no longer performing for love. I wake up and I meet myself as I am. Some days are soft, some are heavy, but none of them require me to disappear. I sit in the quiet now not because I have to, but because I can. Because the quiet no longer feels like punishment. It feels like truth, like presence, like home. I don't need to be loud to be real. I don't need to be understood to be whole. I don't need to be forgiven to move forward. This isn't a confession. It's not closure. It's just me, breathing, living, choosing. Every day I return to that choice, to stay with myself, to speak gently, to walk forward even when no one's watching, especially then. And maybe that's the real freedom. Not the absence of pain, but the refusal to abandon yourself ever again. So if you've heard anything in these words, if any part of it echoed something inside you, then maybe you're already on your way. Maybe this story isn't mine alone. Maybe it never was. Maybe it's ours.